Welcome back, everyone. I hope that your day is going well. It is Tuesday, so I guess you have 3 more days left till the week's over. Anyway, we're going to do a book review today. Before I get to that, I did create this 7 question survey over at Survey Planet. You could put in your email or not, it's optional. And then there's 7 questions. So they all have to do with the content that's on this channel and your preferences and basically how you are enjoying this channel. If you are enjoying it, maybe you're not. Maybe you're hate watching. In any case, this book is a story, not just of a family that once ruled the United Kingdom and created the United Kingdom, if we're being more precise. It's also a bit of an explanation of how the United States came to be and how the British started to colonize the New World. Remember that Spain colonized, Latin America a little earlier than the rest of Europe, partially because Spain was more united and more consolidated. So this is a story mostly about how the Stuart family started in Scotland in the 1300s to rule as the monarchs. But at the time, the monarchy in Scotland was not as strong as one would think in many of the countries. Remember, in Europe, the monarchy in many cases was elected for a while, not elected by the peasants or everybody, usually elected by noblemen, even sometimes by the clergy and the nobility at the same time. And that's the way it was in Scotland for part of its history. You might remember in Braveheart, there was a rivalry between two Scottish noblemen, John de Balliol and Robert de Bruce. That is a true representation, even though there's a lot of inaccuracies in the film, of what the Scottish monarchy was going through during the time of Edward I think it was Edward the First Longshanks, the British the English king. So up until the 16th century, England and Scotland were completely different countries. In fact, the Bruce family and subsequently the Stuart family, both of them were torn between supporting France and England. And the natural tendency in Scotland was actually to support France, but necessity often dictated that the English had some sort of say in who would be the king of Scotland. In fact, the Balliols were basically the pawns of the English, and at a certain point, the Stuarts also became, in many cases, the pawns of the English. And the first Stuart king was Robert II, and he succeeded through a marriage with one of the members of the Bruce dynasty. And that was the end of the Bruce dynasty. You might remember Robert de Bruce, the Scottish character from Braveheart. I'll even bring up his. I think YouTube can hear me. So in any case, yeah. So there's Robert the Bruce was for many people, he was a symbol of the resistance of Scotland, along with William Wallace. So here he is in Braveheart. I think they're actually coming out with a new movie based on this character. But over time, the Bruce family died out and was replaced by the Stuarts, who had been servants of them. And then the Stuarts were the kings of Scotland, kings and queens of Scotland, up until the 1600s. And several of the characters were essential in changing Scotland from just a medieval backwater into part of the greater intrigues and geopolitics of Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Because, as you might know, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, a lot of the determination of who became the monarch and who became all sorts of other positions was done through marriage. And if it actually has a very, see, I have the book here. There's a very interesting guide, and you can see that there are people who throughout the family tree are marrying into other dynasties and therefore becoming basically entwined with the rest of Europe. So up until up until James II of Scotland, you had Scotland a little bit not not connected to the rest of Europe. Then James II married Mary of Gueldres, who was she was a Dutch noblewoman. I think she was the daughter of a Duke of Gelders, which is part of the Netherlands. Then his son, this was in the 1450s, married Margaret of Denmark. Okay, so this was a Danish princess. He did not, I believe he didn't live very long, by the way. So a lot of these people actually did not last very long. Then you have James IV, who married Margaret Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII. Okay, so now you have the Scottish monarchy connected to noble families of Holland and royal families of Denmark and England. Then you have James V marrying Madeline of France, who was a daughter of I think Philip II of France. Doesn't say here. And finally, you have Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the last Stuart monarch to reign only over the Kingdom of Scotland. And she married Francis II, who was a brother of the King of France at the time. I think it was Louis XIII. Might have been Louis XII. I don't remember. And then her son, James VI and I, was therefore a nephew of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, because she was, anyway, it doesn't matter. So we can talk all day about, and we will be talking about who these people married. So in any case, Queen Elizabeth, like the rest of her family, the Tudor dynasty in England, they were constantly trying to ensure that there would be a male heir in order to keep the royal line going. And it just wasn't working. Henry VIII had that issue himself. That's why the Church of England broke off from the Catholic Church. And then, because he had no male heir, his successor was Mary I, and she almost brought England back into the Catholic fold. She's known as Bloody Mary largely because under Henry VIII, many English citizens started to break with Catholicism. It was kind of an opportunity for many people to vent against the Catholic Church, which was not popular, and the Catholic property that was owned by all of these abbots and bishops was confiscated by the state, and some of it was converted into the new Church of England, and some of it was basically appropriated by other corrupt people that were not in the church, right? Or I don't think any of it actually benefited the broader public. But in any case, Mary I died, and then her sister, Elizabeth, became the queen, and she also had no male heir. So through the convoluted process of succession in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, because all four of those, under Henry VIII, it was England, Wales, and Ireland were one kingdom. Scotland was independent at the time. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been imprisoned after a series of crazy wars and marriages between her and various people. She'd been imprisoned by Elizabeth, and she died in the Tower of London let's see here. Oh, she was executed in 1587. So, and by then she'd already been removed from the throne. And then you had James VI of Scotland. James VI of Scotland, upon the death of Elizabeth, became James I of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Or England and Ireland. So he, at the same time, was the King of England, and he was the King of Scotland. There were two different kingdoms at the same time. And then James I's son, and James I, by the way, had a number of children, but it's well known that he was light in the loafers. But he is known for creating the King James Version of the Bible, and he was a very sharp intellectual. In any case, he married Anne of Denmark, and his son would be Charles I, who was king of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Wales was already integrated into England. And through Charles I, England underwent the English Civil War and the First Revolution. And what happened with that was that you saw this Protestant dictatorship rise to power that was Republican at the time. Many people don't know here in the U.S. I don't know how much people learn about this in Britain, but for a period of, 20 years, the British government was a protectorate, they called it, under Oliver Cromwell and his son Robert Cromwell. And at that time, that is when the English state started to really get much more involved in running the country. The English state, the military, because even under the English kings, who had much more power and much more of a bureaucracy to rely on, even they had for a long time had difficulty raising a standing army. Under Oliver Cromwell, who's not a Stuart, that changed because he created the new model army, and likewise Charles I had to raise the Cavalier army. That's where the word Cavalier comes from chevalier, which is the French word for horsemen or cavalrymen. Then Charles I, of course, was executed by Cromwell, beheaded in a gruesome ceremony. It was a shock. Remember, this is before the French Revolution. It was 150 years before it, I believe. And therefore, let me see here. Charles I, 49. So it was 140 years earlier, 145 years. In any case, so this was a brand new issue in Europe, and in fact, there were several attempts to restore the Stuarts in Britain, usually through the intrigues of France and Spain that failed. And then when Cromwell died and his son died, who had succeeded him, making it basically a joke that it was a Republican government, you had the restoration of the Stuarts. And the restored Stuart monarch was Charles II. Charles II is remembered as one of the better monarchs in British history. Charles II is one of the people who started to really try to broaden the theme of at least religious tolerance, if not complete freedom of religion in Britain. And he started to work to compromise with the Scottish Presbyterians, who had rebelled against both the Catholic Church and the Church of England, the Anglicans. And he also tried to ease some of the restrictions against Roman Catholics in Britain, and in particular in England. But it wasn't really something that he could do necessarily openly. People in both England and Scotland had a vested interest in keeping the Catholic Church from regaining its power. And in Ireland, there was a huge gulf between the people who had been part of the plantation. Remember, the Ulster plantation, many of those people had been, I think they actually came a little later, but there had already been Presbyterian settlements in Ulster in particular, but there had always been a bit of a divide between the Catholic Celtic Irish as well, the Hibernian Irish, the people that are traditionally thought of as Irish, and the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the people who had come over. In fact, prior to the Scots Presbyterians, there were, of course, English lords that had ruled there, and they mostly became Anglicans. In any case, so Charles II was trying to balance a lot of that, and he was the most successful of all the Stuart monarchs in doing that. Unfortunately, when he died, he had, one of the big themes of this is that most of these people cheated on their wives. Usually they had many illegitimate children, and in many cases they had no legitimate children. And Charles II, who, let's see if I can pull up, I know visually sometimes it's better. So Charles II of of England. So yeah, he was generally thought of as a very gallant figure. He tried to invade England several years before he came back to power, and he'd actually escaped death several times because his army fell apart and they failed. But eventually he was restored to power, and he also had no legitimate male children. He only had daughters, and I believe he had a lot of like illegitimate male children, including let me see here. He had the Earl of not Montrose. I think it was the Earl of Montrose. Whatever. They're dead now. Who cares? In any case, so Charles II. Yeah, so he was married to Catherine of Braganza, who was a Portuguese princess. And of course, most of his kids were from like random, whores that he would cavort with. I mean, this guy he was like apparently like a royal player, and he would just screw women all the time. And that's why, despite the fact that he administered well, you could say that he was a failure because the monarchy passed to his brother, James II. And let's go back here. So James II was not he was not in himself a horrible ruler, but this is important, remembering what time he was living in. He was a convert to Catholicism when he came to power, and this was a huge no-no in British society at the time. If you were involved in the Catholic Church, that meant that you were probably susceptible to Roman papist influence. So they basically booted him after 3 years, kicked him out of power, and they backstabbed him. I don't think he did anything to deserve it. And they brought in his daughter, in fact, Mary II, and her husband William of Orange, because other Stuarts had been married. The second children of the Stuarts had been married to the Dukes of Orange, who are these Dutch noblemen. So that was the end of Catholicism in the British royal tradition. Okay, there would never be another royal Catholic monarch in any of the British realms. That was done through, I think it was called the Act of Settlement of 1689, which was part of the reason they came to power. They were brought to power. It was called the Glorious Revolution, and then they died, and they were succeeded by her sister Anne. Okay, let's see here. So you got William III. So that's William of Orange, and then you have Queen Anne, who also she is, again. So some of these people were not bad rulers, but they were ultimately failures simply because they couldn't reproduce. And Queen Anne had many, many miscarriages, and it's actually a sad story. Miscarriages and very poor health throughout her life. And some people like to think of royal families as these people who are removed from the suffering of everyday people. I think if you look at Queen Anne, that's not really true. This was a woman who was under extremely high stress because she eventually, I don't think she planned to be the ruler, because of course she was the third child of James II, I believe. She's one of the lesser children of James II, and she probably didn't expect her dad to get overthrown and replaced by her sister, who died before her. Now, once she was dead, God rest her soul, she was succeeded. This is the end of the Stuart monarchy by King George I. And George I in the book is basically not really covered as much because he's not part of the family. By this time, England and Scotland have been united into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and it's become one country. And starting with James I, the British would establish Jamestown in Virginia. They would establish the Plymouth colony for the dissenting English Protestants, known as the Puritans, right? So you have this procession of England, despite all of the problems, despite all of the crazy shenanigans in the royal family of Scotland and England, the various marriages that it crystallized those two countries into one nation that would colonize the world and probably become the largest empire in world history. Now, being that as it is, the Stuart family continued throughout throughout the 18th century to try to grab power again from the Hanoverians. The Hanoverians were George I of Britain was the first monarch over there, and he'd succeeded to the monarchy simply because he was a Protestant and because one of his ancestors had been married to, I believe, a daughter of Charles I, or it might have even been James I. So the succession in Britain after Anne was entirely due to this one person being the closest Protestant relative, and the Stuarts, including her father, who could have still been, I mean, in a manner of speaking, James I was still, I mean, or James II could have still been the leader of Britain. There's no reason why. It was simply because he was a Catholic. He was married to another Catholic, Mary of Modena, an Italian, noblewoman. And from there, you have what are called the Jacobite risings. Okay, the Jacobites were the supporters of James II's son, James Francis Edward Stuart. Okay, he was the old pretender, as they called him. And then you had, so they attempted to take power again in 1715. It was a failed rebellion. Then you had his son, Charles Stuart, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And there's a lot of Scottish folklore about him. It's a very, very heavy topic, I guess, in Scottish history and culture, the Jacobite risings, because in northern Scotland, the Highlands, many of them remained Catholic. Many of them also never really looked at Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, as a real authority. So it was a rebellion against both Scottish authority and English authority at the same time. So it's a very interesting element of British history that they were supporting this monarch, the Stuart monarch, who was trying to say, well, I'm not going to be as much of a tyrant as these German princes that are now the leaders of your country. Anyway, in any case, so his brother was also a cardinal of the church, Henry Stuart. Apparently, he got that position because he was flaming homosexual. But so anyway, these people were very, very influential in France, Italy, and the Catholic world in the 18th century. But afterward, this was like the highest position that a Stuart would reach by that point. Afterward, there was no Stuart restoration. Henry Stuart never had children, obviously, because he never got married. He became this priest, and much of it has been replaced by some of these other people. You have Bonnie Prince Charlie had a long succession of children. You can keep going. Here we go. So he didn't have any. Yeah. This is pretty much the book, The Royal Stuarts, right? So you can pick it up wherever fine books are sold, and you can also look and complete this survey. It is only 7 questions long, concerns a lot of the content that we publish on this YouTube channel, as well as the other places where I publish content. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me on these other platforms if you want. And have a great day.